Good afternoon. I'm Alex Busansky, President of Impact Justice, and I want to welcome you to our first virtual conversation from prison to quarantine. For those of you new to Impact Justice, we are a national innovation and research center based in Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C. Today's conversation is a virtual extension of our Impact Ideas series, and in this and future conversations, we will be digging into the impact COVID-19 has had on all of us. Impact Justice is hosting conversations with a wide range of experts on the front lines of justice reform who can help us to address the challenges, responses, and opportunities emerging in this moment. For today's conversation, we wanted to tackle a critical issue. As many of us here today know well, advocates, policymakers, community members across the country are racing to secure the release of as many people as possible from prisons and jails to combat the fatal spread of COVID-19 inside facilities. There's no such thing as social distancing in prison. Upon release, people are re-entering their communities in the midst of an unprecedented crisis. Securing housing and employment, a challenge under any circumstances, is now next to impossible. As we work to respond to these critical needs, we need to ask, what are the pathways to release and reentry? How are existing barriers being impacted by the pandemic? And what are some scalable solutions that can be quickly implemented to meet the needs of those released? To help us address these questions, we have two amazing guests. First, let me introduce Impact Justice's own Terah Lawyer. Terah finds purpose in working to improve the justice system. She is the program manager for the Homecoming Project at Impact Justice. The Homecoming Project is an innovative reentry housing program that places people leaving prison into homes. Her role includes matching eligible participants to compatible hosts while securing a support network for each arrangement. Being formerly incarcerated, Terah has been an advocate for incarcerated people for more than a decade. As a peer health educator, a certified drug and alcohol counselor, and a youth diversion specialist. It is a pleasure to have her here today. Now let me tell you about our other guest, Keith Wattley and his organization, Uncommon Law. Uncommon Law is also based here in Oakland, California, and works throughout California. Their mission is to provide access to justice and healing for people impacted by incarceration. Their team delivers trauma-informed, healing-centered mental health and legal counseling to help provide a safe pathway home for people serving lengthy prison terms in California. Keith Wattley is the founder and executive director of Uncommon Law. Keith has been advocating for the rights of people in prison and parolees for nearly 20 years. He is an expert in discretionary parole who has represented thousands of clients seeking release from their life sentences, as well as in impact litigation and individual matters involving mental health care, excessive force, and visitation rights. He has trained hundreds of lawyers, law students, and others in advocating for the rights of incarcerated people. Keith has also been honored as a fellow with the Obama Foundation and is the recipient of the James Irvine Foundation's Annual Leadership Award. I want to thank both of you for being here today. And with that, I'm now going to turn this conversation over to Terah, and I will see you all later. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you everyone who tuned in today so that we can cover a very important topic right now happening in our communities. Welcome, Keith. We are so honored to have you here to discuss this current state of release and reentry. I mean, the work that you do advocating for the release of so many people, including my friends, who are often most overlooked in our society, seems especially relevant and urgent right now. We want to use this as a moment to reflect on how we can improve and rethink some of the processes and the framing of release and reentry issues both during this crisis and moving forward. I'm so glad you can be here to lend your expertise and be part of the conversation today. So let's start with the most important thing. What do you see as the current state of release and reentry under COVID-19?
Well, that's a question that might take a while to sort of paint the picture, and I'm not sure any one person has the complete picture either. First, thanks, Terah, and thanks to you, Alex, for having me join you. I feel a little bit silly offering my perspective when, Terah, you're the expert in this. I'm happy to to be joining you and to add what I can. The news, the information that we see about what's happened with coronavirus is overwhelming. You know, it's not just hard to keep up with; it's impossible to keep up with. And I have trouble even fixing myself to try to keep up with it because it's overwhelming and it's heartbreaking. You know, because beyond the numbers are individual people, and you know I'll do what I can to fill in some of the blanks here, but obviously this is just one piece of a much larger conversation that we all need to be having, I think. Right now, there are, I think the last I saw, there are about 20,000 cases of people testing positive in state and federal prisons, plus another, and those are people who are incarcerated, another 6,000 or so staff members in those institutions testing positive. About 230 have died at this point. And most people believe this is an extreme undercount because most prisons are just now starting to test. And so those numbers are climbing very, very rapidly. You know, prisons have long held way too many people in too tight spaces for too long and for the wrong reasons. And they've never been designed to keep people physically or mentally safe. So really no one should be surprised by the inability of state actors to do it now. So what are the prisons actually doing? Well, I mean, as I mentioned, they're hardly testing anyone. And when they do test, they're getting really high percentages of positives. They're just now starting to provide masks, really just in the last week or two. Are people incarcerated starting to get masks delivered to them? And even that's, it's inconsistent. And when you look at the people who are actually moving in and out of the prisons, the staff members, some institutions, very few of them are wearing masks. And we know that there are like 50, 60,000 staff members who move in and out of these institutions in California alone. And they would have to be the primary source of new infections, yet there's inconsistency in the precautions that they take. They have instituted some plans recently over the last few weeks to do some semblance of social distancing to the extent you can in prison. The prisons are in dorms, for example, which are traditionally the most overcrowded. They create clusters of people, clusters of 8 people who are housed really close to each other, separated from the next cluster by 6 feet. That's their version of social distancing. And most other things are done in a communal setting that, I mean, it's impossible to take all the precautions that we think that they should be taking. You know, pursuant to the governor's order, they have also released a number of people. The goal was 3,500 people. And those are people who are set to be released in the next 60 days or so anyway. Let's talk about for a minute what they're not doing. They're not releasing people who are at the greatest risk. They're not supplying most of the PPE needed for those who are still inside. They've mostly ignored calls to release elderly, sick, pregnant women, again, unless they're already close to their release dates anyway. And, you know, we'll probably talk more about this later, but not only did Governor Newsom utilize really harmful, uninformed rhetoric when he talked about violent criminals, but the release of even the 3,500, it was a one-time effort. It's not a sustained effort that will have a huge, huge impact, I think. And here's what I think is the crazy part here. If all that's not crazy enough, is that of the people that the state released, they really had no plan to support the transition of potentially thousands of people from prison to the community. No plans for housing, identification, mental health services, transportation, even to pick them up at the gate at the prison. And most of the other needs that people need when they're released are completely ignored by the state, that is. So what's the state doing? They're relying on community-based organizations to handle all that. They're helping them find housing, provide transportation, help with food, clothing, personal hygiene items, and they're providing masks, hand sanitizers, other supplies just to keep people safe. Now, so consider this. California spends $13 billion on prisons. $13 billion every year. And most of that money is spent on a whole series of like dehumanizing rituals to send people away. And despite 13 billion, you can't find a way to mobilize in a real way to safely bring people home, when to do so could save their lives. So, a lot of what we'll talk about today, I think, is that the result of the state's failure is that you have community-based organizations doing what they always do. They are filling the gap. They're providing the services, the support that people need when they come home, because that's who we are. That's who we've always been. It's not, you look at all the reforms, just a couple, like, it's not the politicians or prison officials who've banned the box on employment applications, who fought to reinstate, voting rights for people with convictions. It's the people most directly impacted who've done that. We also have to remember that state actors, as I just described, they're actually showing up in a way that's consistent with who they've always been, right? They've never actually taken care of the people they ship off to prison, so we shouldn't really expect them to do so now. And just before we move on, I want to be clear that the people who are working in prison, many of them are doing what they think is the right thing to do. The problem is that they're doing it in a system that's set up to do all the wrong things, all the dehumanizing things, and not set up to really respond to a crisis like this in a way that recognizes the humanity and the real needs of the people involved.
Thank you. Just receiving all that heaviness in our reality is enough to make this conversation, as heartbreaking and devastating as the truth is, right? First and foremost, we are in the middle of a public health crisis. But what many community members fail to realize is that our prison system has been in a crisis for many decades. And I can talk about concrete challenges all day long. I can talk about what it looks like in a typical, no public health crisis, no COVID-19. What is the process for individuals that are coming home, right? They're given $200 gate money. They can use that gate money to get their transportation to where they need to go. They can purchase clothes and other essentials, hygiene items and things like that, food. They can possibly get onto some lists for emergency shelters. They can maybe have some access to halfway houses or sober living homes. They can go to the DMV. They can get their ID. It might take 2 weeks. You might have to stand in the line all day, but you can go and get your ID so that you're not a ghost out here in the community, right? We know that if they have no income, they can go and apply at the Social Security office with that ID once they get it. They can then even apply for the Lifeline Assistance Phone, which is also coined the Obama phone. They can begin searching for jobs. They can attend job fairs. They can even try to apply for some open positions, because many people that are incarcerated come home with many different skills and job skills, right? But during COVID-19, this kind of gets flipped on its head, right? They're given the same $200 gate money. However, transportation is very limited right now. Even bus routes are being modified. The BART, the whole schedule has been modified. I'm out here in the Bay Area, so we know that many stores are closed, except for grocery stores. They might be lucky if they can get to Target. And depending on the county, some of these essential stores are only allowing you to purchase the essential items. So they don't look at clothing as essential items. They assume that everyone already has their clothing and they should use what they have. The DMV is closed. The DMV is not even taking any more appointments at this point. You can't go to the Social Security office without your ID. So there's no assistance. There's no stimulus check. There's no added unemployment, and there's nothing from the Social Security office for someone coming home under COVID-19. You can't get a phone if you can't prove that you're getting general assistance. And we know that there are widespread layoffs and unemployment rates are skyrocketing right now just for the average citizen. So imagine someone coming home with a criminal record. We know that this is real. So I can't seem to shake the conversation we had a couple of weeks back when Secretary Diaz over California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation called on all of us partners, and we were coined partners very explicitly, because he was getting ready to release 3,500 individuals whose release dates were due within 30 to 60 and now extended to 90 days. If they fit the category of being a nonviolent crime, there were no domestic violence issues, no sex offenses, these individuals would be a part of his release plan. But he called on us and he asked for us to deliver the transportation services that he didn't have, along with the housing services that he was clearly acknowledging CDCR having a lack thereof. And so I think about this because we're going to do what we do. We're not in this work for the notoriety or we're not clout chasing here, right? What we're doing is we're caring for the people that we've been caring for many, many years, because we've recognized that there has been a big gap in CDCR services and resources for this population. We know recidivism rates are directly tied to people's challenges and transition. We know that if someone can't secure housing and employment, that they're most likely going to resolve to survival mode methods, which involve criminal thinking. We know that this lack of resources and this lack of reentry care, specifically individualized care, is what contributes to the recidivism rate. And yet it is us in the community that's stepping up and creating the services, the housing, the transportation, the welcome kits, the cell phones. It is us doing this work because we recognize the value in people, right? So this isn't necessarily a battle between community services, community organizations, community leaders versus CDCR. We're just meeting this reality as it gets presented to us. This is a crisis. It's been a crisis. I've had 2 releases in the past 2 days, women that were lifers inside of California prisons. One came from CIW, the other came from Central California Women's Facility. Both were told by CDCR staff in the receiving and release unit that they have no ID, that they will get no additional services. Their parole agents told them, we are doing no check-ins, so there's no gift cards being exchanged with the parole agent, which sometimes happens. Essentially, we will do phone check-ins. We will leave you out in the community and hope that you can fend for your best. And so it is us coming together, not just the Homecoming Project, not just Bonafide, not just Insight Prison Guard. All of us community leaders are stepping in to make sure these individuals are not sleeping on the streets, that they are not stranded, not knowing how to navigate bus routes, not knowing how to, they're given their JPay card and they don't know what this is. We're talking individuals that have spent 17 to 30 years incarcerated, who have a cell phone and they're like, how do I answer it? How do I much more navigate how to Google something? These are our concrete challenges right now. And if it wasn't for the safety net of us putting in place for these individuals, I mean, I just can't even imagine. I can't even imagine. I can tell you guys so many stories, but I don't want to hold the conversation hostage with that. We know the realities, we know the challenges. But Keith, I'm going to just ask you, like, what are some of the challenges that may not be visible?
Well, I mean, all the things you touched on are so, so powerfully important, and the role of community-based organizations in filling this gap in the social safety net. I mean, it's who they've always been. As long as there's been a gap, as long as there've been holes in the safety net, we're there because we're not going to let the people in our community continue to suffer without doing something about it. And I just think the communities have always really held the solutions, which is why we're seeing community-based organizations show up the way they are. But I also think that there's this piece about when you think about the stuff you don't see, but the stuff that's all around you, like the system in which we are trying to operate, makes it really inevitable some of the outcomes we see. For example, many people have observed that this virus is simply laying bare many of the racial and economic disparities that affect most aspects of our society. And I think the systemic inequities are really inevitable when you consider that it's based on the society we live in. It shouldn't be a surprise that Black and brown and poor people are more likely to die from COVID-19 than other people who get it. Nobody should be surprised by that. We should be called to action, but we shouldn't be surprised by it. When you consider that every generation in this country, since the country was founded, has been taught that darker skinned people threaten the safety and security of everybody else. On the front end of the criminal justice system, we've always seen biases in policing and citations and arrests, charging and bail decisions and plea negotiations and sentencing and incarceration. All those things continue. And then on the back end, we have really the same law enforcement people who locked us up are now in charge of deciding whether and when we can safely be released. And then we have the governor of the most populous state in the union recklessly referring to violent criminals. And we have the DA of the most populous county in the country saying that certain people have an evil heart and are incapable of changing. These are the same racial tropes that have driven mass incarceration for decades. I mean, especially the idea that people who commit violence, especially Black and brown people, that they lack the capacity to change. And even though the evidence actually proves the contrary, those ideas have driven so many of our policies, so that none of us should be surprised at what we're seeing. We should be called to action to say, no more are we going to continue this. I mean, I'll tell you, when I look at, and I have trouble looking at the news, when you see another young brother beaten down, somebody else who gets shot and killed right here in the Walmart in San Leandro, who's in the middle of a mental health crisis. Police kill him. If we don't do something about these issues now, when there's some attention on it, when we've all paused in one way or another, then why would we ever care when things speed back up? We won't. The community-based organizations will, but if we're going to rely on state actors to make those changes, it's not going to happen. We need to give a voice to the people whose voices have been ignored for so long, and they need to be directly involved in making some decisions about what kind of systems we have and who's in charge of running them. But that means acknowledging these disparities, acknowledging the biases that exist at every level of the criminal legal system, for sure.
Yeah, I just think back to my own story, and if I may just share a little. As a formerly incarcerated woman who served 15 years in custody on a life sentence, locked up at 18, released at 33, I essentially developed into a woman inside, and yet was very socially handicapped when it comes to practical matters regarding adulthood. And so I think about coming home, being high and intoxicated with freedom and the possibilities of so many different, choices and decisions that I get to kind of orchestrate in my life. And I went to a transitional housing program, and I'm so incredibly grateful to that experience, to having a bed to sleep in, to being provided food, to the sisters of mine that were also formerly incarcerated, because that is really where the support came in at.
it was their mentorship, their guidance that kind of led me to acclimate to what it was in the world today. And so it wasn't, you know, I think about never ever allowing myself to be ungrateful for that transitional housing program. It was state contracted. But I couldn't help but think, you know, with my education, with my professional experience, with my passion and drive, that we could be doing so much better. And, you know, this cookie cutter approach towards receiving and release, the reentry sector is, the infrastructure is so fragmented. And we know what's necessary. We know that the only thing in common that formerly incarcerated people have is that they're formerly incarcerated. They each and all of them come with their own set of unique circumstances. And it's very rare that we see sort of that individualized care and services that are tailored towards people's specific needs. And yet we lack the resources to kind of deliver that care and to deliver that service. So we can talk about ideal, right? But before I get into that, I want to talk about like the importance of community, because I wouldn't be where I'm at, sitting here having a conversation with you, Keith Wattley, if it wasn't for the community. It was people who have already sort of been aware of the challenges and the real live crisis of our reentry population, believing in redemption and second chances for those individuals that are coming home. People believing in, you know, people, I think is like that sort of value that strong community members hold for those individuals that are most vulnerable. And when I say vulnerable, a formerly incarcerated person is especially vulnerable because there's some arrested development, there's post-incarceration syndrome, there's acclimation, there's adjustment curves, there's so many different issues surrounding individuals that are coming home that a lot of people are unaware of. They think that, number one, the state provides plenty of those resources for them to kind of just step into their second chance, their life, and they're just expected to perform to some extent, right? But I can speak from experience that I can pinpoint many different points in my transition where I could be homeless, where I could have been gone without food. I could think about many times where I could have applied for unemployment, where I would have had to heavily rely upon food stamps. I know these pivotal moments, and if it wasn't for a community member, a community organization, so I want to talk like, what does it mean to like really experience release during a time when communities themselves are simultaneously going through a tremendous amount of isolation and displays of mutual aid?
Yeah, I think it's so clear the important role that communities serve when welcoming people home and supporting them in this transition. They're doing the things they've always done. I think, as I mentioned before, I think communities have always held the solutions, but after really, decades of divesting resources away from them, we've left them unable to take care of themselves in a lot of ways, in the effective ways. Yet we still get it done, right? The organizations and individuals in the community still find a way. But I also think that when we're kind of in this pause state right now, that we really need to seize this opportunity to reimagine our response to crime, and that includes violent crime, for sure. And reimagine ways that we can reinvest in the community to actually make a difference, actually choose a different way. If you look at what we've done for way too long, we've defaulted to incarceration. We talk about developing diversion programs, we talk about developing alternatives to incarceration. But incarceration should be the alternative, but like the last one, not the first one. It's not the default. It's not the first thing we go to. which it has been. We pretend that our communities are actually safer by removing people from their families, isolating them in faraway, dehumanizing environments. And we trust the state to do something that people call rehabilitation, whatever that is, and eventually send them back when they get done with it. You know, this approach has never created public safety. If it had, we've been doing it so long, we'd be the safest, healthiest civilization ever, right? You know, in so many ways, relying on actors outside the community is really the worst thing you could do for overall public safety. What's more, it doesn't even keep crime survivors safe. Indeed, a lot of the criminal legal policies are implemented, developed in the name of crime survivors and victims. Yet most of the time, they're actually left out of the process. Their needs aren't even met. Given other options, many survivors would prefer a process that leads to accountability and safety without prison. But rarely do we make that an option. We haven't done that. As I said, you know, we're in a state that is spending $13 billion every year on corrections. Yet the organizations actually doing this release work to bring people safely home are relying on handouts on Giving Tuesday to meet the needs of the community. How backwards is our priority here? Like, and how much is this obvious in this setting? The communities have the answer, and we need to figure out a way to really reinvest in those meaningful programs that can really lead the way forward.
Yeah, I think something that I picked out of the current of what you just said is like changing the narrative. How do you get people to change their mind when we live in a society that is so punitive, right? I had the pleasure of going to Finland and Norway to really analyze their prison system, their criminal justice system. And it didn't even feel like a system, right? Like, first and foremost, there wasn't any homeless individuals on the street because it is unheard of for their, you know, welfare state to even neglect anyone just because they can't care for themselves adequately. I mean, it makes me think about housing, how it is a right. And I mean, the Finland individuals that we got a chance to speak with, I mean, housing is a right, right? Now, when we started out the Homecoming Project, we thought this was just going to be a housing program. And for the listeners that don't know what the Homecoming Project is, it is a definite innovative approach towards housing, utilizing the shared economy model. Individuals who have extra bedrooms in their home that are not being used will go through our intake process, essentially be matched with an individual coming home from prison. We place them with them for 6 months. We pay the host for housing that individual. We match our participants with a community navigator who creates an individualized reentry plan. Then we walk them through step by step their successes, their personal goals, their, you know, required assignments of acclimating. I mean, we have small numbers, right? We are hustling to show how important this program is specifically. But if you think about it, this isn't just a housing program. What we've created is a relationship, an introductory relationship of an individual who's been ostracized, who's been sort of expelled out of society, and showing them how to be a part of their community. It's a big support and a reflection of community inclusion. And so changing the narrative through this program is something that is just organically happening, getting people to see that these are just people whose bad choices, everyone can relate to bad choices and regrets. Their choices led to incarceration. Whereas I'm pretty sure everyone on this call can think about a time when a bad choice could have led to incarceration, whether it did or not. The fact is that how long after someone is completed their sentence in prison do we want to continue to punish them?
right? With the obstacles and the restrictions and the limitations. So, I mean, I know that housing is so key. It's like the fundamental need for individuals to kind of transition back into society. But I would love to know, like, what do you feel is the most important thing that we can do as a community to support release and reentry?
Well, you obviously touched on a lot of, but I think we have to just get real about the fact that the solutions are not going to come from our state actors. I mean, I think we shouldn't really fool ourselves to believe that whether it's the federal government or state government, county, city, that they're going to do right by Black and brown and poor people. They never have. And within the existing structures, they never will. And so we need to recognize that the way we, in the long term, especially, make things better is we have to replace these structures and replace the people running them. But there's some short-term things that we can do. And I think, we keep talking about the role of community-based organizations, obviously, but there are some folks who I think are doing such a great job of filling some of these gaps and sometimes pushing governmental actors to do the right thing. I think about, we've talked a lot about the state prisons and people being released from there, but there's actually more movement in county jails and getting people out. It's not consistent for sure. There are a lot of gaps. A lot of people are stuck there. A lot of people running jails have committed to just keeping them full. But locally here in Alameda County and San Francisco County, you have public defenders offices often sort of leading the charge here. Brendan Woods here, Mano Raju over in San Francisco are refusing to accept whatever's handed out. They're continuing to demand that people be released. They're pushing back against the fact that the constitutional right to a speedy trial has been deprived. Somehow that disappeared in this. But we also really, we just have to recognize, we talked about some of the supplies and things that are coming into the prisons. Some of those are being created, developed, manufactured in the prisons. Some masks have been made. Some prisons have turned their factories into factories to produce hand sanitizer. But thousands and thousands of supplies are being sent in from community-based organizations. No funding from the state, they're just getting it done, right? They're finding people on the outside and they're providing thousands of masks, they're providing cleaning supplies. Now to the prison officials' credit, they're allowing it to come in. But the fact that community-based organizations have to go outside and find vendors, find funders to support this effort, to send an inside a $13 billion industry, tells us where our priorities are and really what's missing. I think it's important to recognize who some of these actors are. And Terah, you mentioned a couple of them earlier, but there's some people who, and organizations who just so clearly committed to providing concrete aid, picking people up from the prison and finding when they pick them up, they don't know where the person's going and figuring that out with them. The people committed to doing that. There are organizations that have been doing this for a while. Some have really shifted their focus, made a serious pivot to just meet the needs of the community. And there are way too many to name here, but I'm, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take a minute and list a few of them that I'm aware of that are providing all this support, all these services, these supplies to people who need it. Bonafide is one that you mentioned before. They've long been a go-to spot for people who have no one else to pick them up when they come home from prison. Choices for Freedom, A New Way of Life, Time for Change, All of Us or None. Amity Foundation's really stepped up in a major way with housing. Anti-Recidivism Coalition, Initiate Justice, Inside Garden Program, Restore Justice, Young Women's Freedom Center. These are organizations and individuals who are doing what they need to do to provide specific concrete supplies and support on the inside. Masks for the people, if you haven't heard about that one. Pastor Mike, and Asian Prisoner Support Committee, New Earth down in Los Angeles. Really, there are way too many to name. We can't leave out, we got Mother's Day coming up. SC Justice is committed to bringing their mamas home. This is who the community is. These are the specific kinds of things that they're providing. One of the big missing pieces, obviously, is that the $13 billion is not going to these groups. We need to find a way to support them better. We need to give them the support they need. Funders need to remove restrictions on how they use funding, recognize that these are the folks who have the solution and need the support. They're not getting it from the state. The state has allowed them to come pick people up. That's about it. They're allowing them to send materials in, but we have a long way to go. And I think the needs are great. And I think the other thing that we have to do as we consider the best way to move forward and the foundation we want to establish for that road forward, it has to do with, we have to reject the use of this othering, scapegoating language that reinforces the status quo in the name of reform. You know, particularly reforms that unfairly exclude people convicted of violent crimes, and also those reforms that refuse to account for the ways in which those who cause harm have also experienced harm. This way that we only define a victim or a survivor as someone who's not incarcerated. That's absurd. It ignores the needs of so many thousands of people who will be coming home. And as a community, we need to help make them safe. And I think we have a lot of the solutions, but we need to reinvest in the community-based organizations in particular, to get there.
Oh my goodness, this conversation is so good. I am a hopeless optimist, and oftentimes I try to find a little silver lining during dark times, right? And so I think about, aside from, the criminal justice efforts that, we all focus on, right? You're all about decarceration, and I'm kind of that receiving net, making sure that they land safely. And I know that people are showing up in ways that we would have never had seen if it wasn't for COVID-19. For me, that's comforting. For me, that's acknowledging that we need to be able to do more for those that can't do for themselves, number one. And we're seeing that throughout our entire country. If you just look at San Francisco, the homeless are off of the streets and they're put into hotel rooms. There's people, pushing out more like food packages for those that are in need. More support is being poured out into our communities for those that need it the most, right? And it really is showcasing people's humanity. That's the silver lining in COVID-19. But I think we deal with a unique situation because reentry, prison conditions, pre-trial, all these have been in a very fractured infrastructure in and of itself for a long time. But I think this is a great moment in our time to kind of highlight issues that have already been in place and to show, just think about prison itself right now. Just when we thought you couldn't isolate someone even more, they're finding creative ways to isolate them even more, right? And I get the bulletin, I get CDCR's COVID bulletin, and I see the numbers of incarcerated individuals almost rampantly, like just ramping up of those that are testing positive. I remember when it was the first person that was testing positive, and now we're over 200. And I think about just that you can't practice social distancing in prison when you are essentially living on top of each other. But I want to leave everyone with some ways that they can get involved, because there is quite a bit of work that is still needing to be done. And so I want to give you an opportunity
opportunity to kind of highlight some of the ways that people on this call can spread out the word to get involved and support our own efforts and support other efforts that are being made throughout the community.
I have a long list of things that I would recommend that people do. People who are listening to this call and participating here, but also people who may never hear this directly, but they involve state and local actors, activist organizers, and some other leaders in Sacramento who need to hear this and do some things differently. There's some immediate solutions, I think, or immediate actions, including you got to release pregnant women, elderly people whose immune systems are compromised, and provide the support they actually need to return to the community. If we can't find in $13 billion the resources to do that, we are a failed state. I also think so. In making that happen, the CDCR, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, has to designate a point person whose job it is to make sure that at least the most basic things are provided for people being released, and provide that person with the support, resources, and accountability to get it done. I think that they need to immediately test every single correctional worker and every person currently incarcerated, so we can actually slow down the spread inside, which is the peak. We can't even see the peak yet, not even close. The couple hundred cases they found are of a couple hundred tests they've done. So we've got a long way to go. I think that every person who lives or works in a jail, prison, or juvenile detention facility should get masks, hand sanitizer, cleaning supplies. I don't want to go down on this road, but I was talking to somebody yesterday inside who said the only way they get cleaning supplies is if somebody who happens to work in close proximity to the cleaning supplies steals it, brings it back, and sells it to people in the housing unit. That's how it gets done in some places. So we have to make sure those things are available and that they're allowed to practice social distancing to the extent possible. I think we have to push hard for adequate telephone contact, free of charge, continue to make it free for people in prison to connect with their families on the outside, their supporters. I think we need to make sure that there's adequate confidential telephone contact between people inside and their attorneys on the outside. I think funders need to heavily support those organizations we mentioned, and I think we'll probably share something with everybody who registered for this particular event, a list of who those organizations are, and maybe identify some of the ways that they are participating right now. And I think that longer term, we need to not miss this huge opportunity to reimagine what's possible, to center the people who are most directly impacted by this system. We should focus on replacing actors in the public sector with those who are committed to actual change. And that includes shifting resources away from isolating people and more towards restoring them, establishing them back in the community, establishing incarceration as a last alternative to community-led solutions. We need to push for hire, elect, change-minded people. That's at the sheriffs, police, that's the prosecutors, probation chiefs, prison wardens, correctional officers, state officials, at every level. People have to be committed to that or it won't happen. And I think we also have to support legislation and other policies that reduce the impact of bias, and that actually support full integration after incarceration. I mean, those are things many of us talked about, and I don't want to spend too much time about, but voting rights, education, employment, housing, other social services, all those things. And just to finish on some of my long list here, it's about, because so many people have to go, in California at least, have to go through a parole board in order to be released. I mean, that's where I spend most of my time, dealing with the parole board, trying to understand how to help people successfully navigate that. but there's so much bias that's built into the system that culminates in a parole hearing that requires career law enforcement people to feel comfortable releasing someone who admitted to having committed a serious or violent crime. I think we need to have commissioners with backgrounds in empathy work and compassion, child development, transformation, and restorative justice. And I also think, I mean, this is probably could have been on the immediate solution. The governor needs to commute the sentences of people who are convicted under age 26, who served at least 15 years, unless there's some actual conduct that shows that they're a risk to public safety. This is, a little bit of my list. And this is a long-term conversation, obviously. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate with you, Terah, and learn your perspective, because, as I said, you're the expert on what this actually looks and feels like, and an expert on what it looks like to provide a community-based solution as you're doing with your project now.
Thank you so much, Keith. I am going to pass it on to Alex so that we can talk about questions. And Alex, please also highlight how other people can support Homecoming as well.
So a couple of things. First, thank you both, Keith and Terah. We've had a number of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but there is one that I would like to just sort of tackle. But before I do that, let me say a couple of things. One, people have been asking, this conversation today has been recorded, and we will be sending this out to everybody who's obviously participated and registered for this, as well as our larger group and probably social media. And feel free to watch it again, send it to a friend, highlight it in some way. We have some of the questions that we're not going to get to today. Many of them are focused around where can I go to help? What can I do to help? What are the resources that are needed? Some of the things that both you two were talking about today. And we'll be following up with information to people about some of the things that are available. For the Homecoming Project, for those people who are interested in it, you can learn more about it at the Impact Justice website. You can become a host. You can recommend a host, and there's actually a sort of a finder's fee for that. You can contribute to our sort of emergency COVID fund to help support some of the resources that people need that we're trying to get them in this difficult time. But as you heard from Keith and Terah, there's lots of incredible organizations that are desperate for the funding and the support to be able to do this. Because while CDCR and others might call us all partners, we're not funded like partners, and everybody needs help. So all of that will be tremendously appreciated. There's one thing I guess want to quickly, we only have a couple of minutes left, but there's one question I want to pose to you, and it goes back to what you said at the beginning, Keith, when you called out the governor, and I believe it was the DA in Los Angeles, for their language about people who have been incarcerated for having commit what we deem to be violent offenses, that they're sort of violent people, this sort of narrative piece that I know people have been wrestling with trying to push back on to create space for reform for a long time. How do you see this moment, if you do, as different and an opportunity to be able to help to move that conversation and to change that narrative? And I pose that really to both of you.
Terah, you want to take a crack? I have some thoughts, but I'm curious what you'd add.
You both have to be quick, and I apologize for that, but okay.
It's all just, I mean, I think, prisons are made to, not let anyone that's inside see what's outside, and those that are outside to see what's inside. And it's designed that way to create an obstacle for even those that want to help. But I mean, we did a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about CBO's oversight, because no one is holding CDCR accountable. But, I think you are really able to address the violent component, because that is orchestrated and against, that narrative is kind of pushing and reinforcing that fear in our communities. And really, it's almost like whatever I can influence people to see something that might not necessarily be the truth, but if you are already exposed to this narrative, then that's what you're going to see.
Yeah.
And we know that that is not the case in all situations.
And what I would add is that we have a system that relies on de-individualizing people and dehumanizing them, and we have a whole series of rituals to do that. We take away their name, we give them a number instead. We send them off from prison, take away their clothes, put them in blues. We call them names like defendant, inmate, convict, juvenile, prisoner, and we tell stories about who they are. And those stories have driven mass incarceration, for sure. But I think in this moment, we have the opportunity to shift that in two ways. One is that we can say, well, what is the language doing? What is the language driving? And then the other way is, well, what do the people involved say about themselves? Who do they say they are and what they need? So this is why, Terry, you're like the perfect person to be here. But this is going to be led by people who've been to prison and people who have a sense of what the solutions are, whose voices have been, ignored for way too long. And so I support making sure that they help lead the way, because they know their own stories. They know who they are, and they know the journeys that they've traveled. And they're the ones who can control the language. So the language then drives reform in this effort.
Great. Again, I so wish we had more time, but thank you so much for the time that we've had and the time that you've taken to be part of this, both of you. As I said at the beginning, there will be further conversations with other individuals around this issue, and we'll be sending out information in the next couple of days about our next one. Again, this is recorded. There's more information at impactjustice.org. Uncommon Law is a phenomenal organization and one that also needs support. And so please feel free to check out their website and to see more about what they do and the incredible people who work there, in addition to Keith. And I also just want to quickly give a shout out to my colleagues who really worked hard putting this together. There's many of them, but particularly Hannah Miller and Andy Anderson for the time that they spent making this happen. You all haven't seen them, but they've been great at this. So I look forward to seeing you in the future. For now, let me just say, stay safe, be well, and if you can give someone you love a hug, do it. We all need one right now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.